Look at this map. Every red mark is a war that should not exist. Every border drawn by men who never lived there. In a quiet room in London in 1916, two diplomats sat down with a pencil, and the lines they drew, we are still bleeding from them today. Let me ask you something. You see what is happening in the Middle East right now? Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq. And you have probably asked yourself the same question I did. Why does this never stop? Why is it always the same map, the same lines, the same wars? So I went looking into the archives, the cables, the handwritten letters nobody reads anymore, 3 promises, same piece of land, written 18 months apart, by the same government, to 3 different people. 3 contradictions, all sent, and everything that followed began right here. Stay with me. By the time we finish, you will know exactly how it happened, and you will never look at the news the same way again. A map of one region of the world. Every active conflict zone shaded in red. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Gaza, Yemen. Every red line on this map was drawn by men who had never been there. They drew it in a closed room in London in May 1916. They were 2 diplomats with a pencil and a map of someone else's land. Their government had already promised that same land to a second group of people. Within 18 months, it would promise parts of it to a third. 110 years later, the blood that began flowing then has never stopped. Before 1916, the region we now call the Middle East was not divided the way it is today. There was no country called Iraq, no Syria, no Lebanon, no Jordan, no state of Israel. There was Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. There was the Levant, the eastern shore of the Mediterranean. There was the Hejaz, the western coast of Arabia where Mecca stands. All of it was governed from a single capital, Istanbul, the seat of the Ottoman Empire, the empire we examined in our last episode. For 400 years, the Sultan in Istanbul ruled this region through provincial governors. Borders inside the empire were administrative, not national. A merchant could travel from Damascus to Baghdad to Mecca without crossing a single foreign frontier. That world was about to end. By the start of the 20th century, 6 powers had a stake in what would become of this land. Britain controlled India and needed a safe overland route through Mesopotamia. After 1908, when oil was discovered in Persia, that route also led to fuel. France held a historical claim over Lebanon and Syria going back to the Crusades, reinforced by centuries of Catholic missionary work. Russia wanted the city of Constantinople and the sea passage through the straits. For 300 years, this had been the goal of every Russian czar. The Ottoman Empire itself was collapsing, forced by debt and military pressure into an alliance with Germany. In Arabia, Sharif Hussein of Mecca governed the holy cities under Ottoman authority and dreamed of leading an independent Arab kingdom. And in Europe, a movement called Zionism, organized since 1897, was seeking a homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine. 6 players, 1 piece of land. The war that began in 1914 would force every one of them to act. Between July 1915 and November 1917, the British government made 3 promises about the future of the Middle East. Each promise was made to a different group. Each promise involved the same land. None of them could be kept together. The first promise began in Cairo, in the summer of 1915. A British official named Henry McMahon was the High Commissioner of Egypt. He began a correspondence with Sharif Hussein of Mecca. Over 10 letters across 8 months, McMahon offered Britain support for an independent Arab state, stretching from the Mediterranean coast to the Persian Gulf, in exchange for an Arab revolt against the Ottomans. The promise was not vague. The Arab state would include Damascus, Aleppo, Hama, Homs, the whole length of the eastern Mediterranean and the Arabian Peninsula. Hussein accepted. In June 1916, the Arab revolt began. Tens of thousands of Arab fighters turned against their Ottoman rulers, believing they were fighting for their own future kingdom. But that same month, in London, the second promise was already being drawn, in secret, to someone else. Mark Sykes was a British baronet and a minor expert on the Near East. François-Georges Picot was a French diplomat with deep family ties to Lebanon. Sykes was 36 years old. He had toured the region by horseback. He carried a romantic vision of the Arab world he had seen as a young man. Picot was older. He had served as the French consul general in Beirut. He cared above all about protecting the Christian Maronites of Lebanon under French authority. Their two governments asked them a single question. After the war, who gets what? They drew a map. France would take direct control of coastal Lebanon and influence over inland Syria. Britain would take direct control of southern Mesopotamia, including the oil fields of Basra, and influence over the rest. The map had 4 zones: a blue zone of direct French control, a red zone of direct British control, 2 zones marked A and B of indirect influence. Each color decided the fate of millions of people who would never see the map. Palestine would be administered internationally. The whole arrangement was to remain secret from the Arabs whose revolt was now underway. The Sykes Picot Agreement was signed in May 1916, 1 month before the Arab revolt began. The third promise came 18 months later, November 2nd, 1917. A letter from the British Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, to Lord Walter Rothschild. 1 sentence. His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. The same Palestine already promised to the Arabs. The same Palestine reserved as an international zone in Sykes-Picot. Why a national home for the Jews? Why in November 1917? The answer lay in part with a Russian-born chemist named Chaim Weizmann. Weizmann was a professor of chemistry at the University of Manchester. He had invented a process for producing acetone, the chemical Britain needed to manufacture cordite for shells and bullets. His scientific service to the war effort opened doors at the highest levels of the British government. Britain also calculated that public support for Zionism would help win American Jewish opinion to the Allied side, deepening United States' commitment to the war. 3 promises, same land. 3 groups who would believe for a time that the future of the Middle East belonged to them. The British officer assigned to the Arab revolt knew the truth. T.E. Lawrence had read the Sykes-Picot Agreement. He was leading Arab fighters into battle for a kingdom his own government had already secretly given away. He had led the Arabs in the capture of Aqaba in 1917, crossing the Nafud Desert with 50 men in a march still studied in military academies today. He kept the secret through the war. He would carry the weight of it for the rest of his life. After the war, Lawrence tried to advocate for an Arab kingdom at the Paris Peace Conference in 1919. He failed. He resigned his commission and spent the rest of his life in deliberate obscurity. Lawrence is not a historical curiosity. He is every person who ever sat in a room and watched a decision get made that they knew was wrong. He kept the secret. He thought he could fix it later. He could not. The secret broke in November 1917, not in London, in Petrograd. When the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia, they opened the Imperial Archives. Inside, they found the full text of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, signed by their former Tsar. Leon Trotsky, the new Bolshevik foreign minister, ordered the agreement translated and released. On November 26, 1917, the Manchester Guardian printed the full text on its front page. Within weeks, the secret arrangement was reprinted in newspapers from Cairo to Damascus. Sharif Hussein read it in the desert and understood what had been done to him. In 1920, the Treaty of Sèvres formalized the carve-up. France took its mandate. Britain took its mandate. The Hashemites were given consolation kingdoms in Iraq and Transjordan. In 1948, the British mandate over Palestine ended. The State of Israel was declared. The first Arab-Israeli war began the same day. 700,000 Palestinians fled or were forced from their homes in what became known as the Nakba. The displaced population grew across generations into the millions. In 1967, in 6 days, those borders were redrawn again by force. They have not been settled since. In 2003, an American-led coalition invaded Iraq, dismantling a state Britain had assembled 83 years earlier. In 2011, Syria collapsed into civil war. The French mandate dissolved in real time. In 2014, militants of a group calling itself the Islamic State released a video bulldozing the border post between Iraq and Syria. They titled it, "The End of Sykes Picot." In 2026, Gaza, Lebanon, Yemen, and the Iranian frontier remain active conflicts. Every one of them runs along a line drawn by men who had never lived there. You have heard this region explained as ancient grievance, as resource competition, as ideology. The answer is geometry. The lines do not fit the people. The people did not draw the lines. Everything else is consequence. In our last episode, we covered the empire that fell in 1918, the Ottoman Empire that ruled this land for 600 years. The men in the London room were dividing its corpse. In our first episode, we examined the Strait of Hormuz. The reason Iraq has only 58 kilometers of coastline on the Persian Gulf, just enough to give Britain access to the oil it would need, was Sykes Picot. In our third episode, the petrodollar, we traced the kingdom of Saudi Arabia. That kingdom exists because Sykes Picot did not carve the Arabian interior. Ibn Saud conquered the Hejaz in 1925 and founded a country in the space the diplomats had left empty. In our fifth episode, Operation Ajax, the Iran the British and Americans overthrew in 1953 carried borders and oil concessions inherited from the same partition. The same hand that drew the lines in 1916 drew the framework of every conflict we have covered. There is a pattern here, and it is older than the modern world. When empires fall, the borders they leave behind are drawn by whoever holds the pencil, and whoever holds the pencil draws for himself. 110 years after Sykes and Picot, the lines they drew still kill. 30 million Kurds live as a people without a state, divided across 4 of those lines. They were promised a state in 1920 at the Treaty of Sèvres. The promise was withdrawn at the Treaty of Lausanne 3 years later. They have been waiting ever since. Palestinians, Druze, Alawites, Yazidis, Maronites, all carry passports issued by states they did not choose, governed by borders they did not consent to. There is no obvious solution. The countries are real now. Their populations were born inside them. To redraw the map would be another century of war. But to leave it as it is to accept that the future of this region was decided in 1916 by 2 men who had never lived there. There is no honest answer because the problem was designed not to have one. Return to the map. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Gaza, Yemen. The red zones are still red. The ink dried in 1916. The blood has not. The men who drew the lines are dust. The lines remain. You will close this video. You will open the news tomorrow. There will be a headline from somewhere along these lines, but the lines they drew will still be there, shaping what you read. This is Links of History, because nothing happening today began today.